July 7, 2017. Night falls over San Francisco International Airport. Air Canada Flight 759 is moments from landing after a routine flight from Toronto. The runway appears ahead, or what they thought was a runway, lined up with Taxiway Charlie, where 4 fully loaded aircraft waits below for takeoff. The world wouldn't know how close it came to disaster until the very next morning.
Happened Friday night. It was, in fact, a very close call.
It almost landed on top of 4 jets on the taxiway.
Narrowly missed crashing into several planes at SFO.
It could have been the worst crash in aviation history, but no one was hurt. Now, we relive the chilling seconds before impact. Air Canada Flight 759 was scheduled to depart from Toronto's Pearson International Airport to San Francisco International Airport in the United States at time 55 minutes past 8 in the evening. The flight comprised of 135 passengers, 3 cabin crews, and 2 pilots. The aircraft involved was a 25-year-old workhorse Airbus A320 with 2 CFM engines. The airplane itself didn't have any faults in it. The captain of this flight was 56-year-old with Canadian pilot's license. He had over 20,000 flying hours experience with over 7,000 hours on Airbus A320, out of which he had 4,797 hours as captain on A320. After operating a flight a day before, the captain woke up around 45 minutes past 7 in the morning on the day of the incident flight. The captain was on reserve duty that day. Reserve duty is where a pilot is at home and may be called up for a flight during the period of his reserve duty hours. The captain was called out for this flight at 13 minutes past 11 in the morning. He didn't take any naps during the day before the flight. He reported for duty at 40 minutes past 7 in the evening. Captain had flown twice to San Francisco in recent past. The first officer, aged 42, also had a Canadian pilot's license with about 10,000 hours under his belt, out of which he had 2,343 hours on A320. On the day of the incident flight, he woke up at 9 in the morning, then took a 1 hour 30-minute nap in the afternoon, and finally reported for the flight at time 10 minutes past 7 in the evening. He flew the same flight from Toronto to San Francisco a day before. They both anyhow felt pretty much rested before the flight. The reason I am highlighting these details is because they play a crucial role in understanding what happened that night. While at the gate, both pilots reviewed the flight documents, including fuel requirements, weather conditions at the departure and destination airport, en route weather, and specifically the NOTAMs. NOTAMs stand for Notice to Airmen, that are things related to an airport that are under maintenance or not available for some reason. One critical piece of information that was not available for use by the crew upon arrival at San Francisco Airport was runway 28 left, which was closed at the time due to scheduled maintenance work. Even a minor oversight in reviewing NOTAMs can have a significant impact on flight preparation and the final outcome. The flight pushed back from gate at 25 minutes past 9 in the evening. They lined up the runway at Toronto Airport. At about 10 p.m., they advanced thrust levers for takeoff. The captain was the pilot flying, and the first officer was the pilot monitoring for this flight. The initial climb and cruise was uneventful. The passengers meanwhile enjoyed the dinner service at night. As the flight progressed into the cold night, there were few thunderstorms that the crew had to maneuver around. The flight crew later reported that after maneuvering around thunderstorms was when they both started to feel tired. They were flying in the middle of the night while the rest of the world slept and were nearing their circadian low period. The circadian low refers to the time during a person's 24-hour biological rhythm when alertness and performance are at their lowest. For most people, this typically occurs between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. when the body naturally wants to sleep. As for a pilot, being active during this low period can lead to increased fatigue, slower reaction times, and decreased situational awareness. The flight continued safely as they closed towards their destination. San Francisco Airport is located 8 miles to southeast of San Francisco City. The airport comprises of 4 parallel crossed runways. For today's story, runway 28 left and 28 right will be of utmost importance. Runway 28 right was 11,870 feet long and 200 feet wide. It had white runway edge lights and white centerline lights. Runway 28 right had a localizer which helps pilots to track the runway centerline. It is a very good tool to be used when flying all approaches, specifically when flying a visual approach. To the right of runway 28 right was the Taxiway Charlie. It was 12,330 feet long and 75 feet wide, with green centerline lights and blue edge lights. We saw in the NOTAMs runway 28 left was closed due maintenance. As the crew of flight 759 approached the top of descent point, they took the ATIS on A-cars for San Francisco Airport. ATIS is Automated Terminal Information Service. It provides pilots with current information including weather, winds, visibility, temperature, pressure, active runways, available approaches, NOTAMs, operational advisories. That ATIS too had written that runway 28 left was closed due maintenance. After reviewing the ATIS, the crew expected to shoot the FMS bridge visual approach into runway 28 right at San Francisco. While preparing for descent, the first officer, as per Air Canada's procedures, should set the approach and MCDU navigates and tune or verify the correct ILS identifiers on the primary flight display. Unfortunately, this was not done, and Captain could have verified that the ILS is not tuned, but he also missed it. It was an opportunity that error may have been caught. But why did both of them miss to do it? Generally, the ILS frequency is auto-tuned when you select an approach in the MCDU. If we look on the other side of the approach chart for FMS bridge visual approach, you can see that this approach required to manually tune the ILS frequency to get the indication of the localizer for runway 28 right. Out of all the approaches in Air Canada's A320 database, this was the only approach which needed to do this step manually. Unfortunately, both pilots failed to read that section of the approach chart precisely, which could have helped them to maintain alignment with runway 28 right centerline, and this incident might never have occurred. They missed to set up ILS frequency for runway 28 right. The crew somehow had insufficient preparation for the approach. Captain briefed for the approach to his first officer, discussed threats for the approach like it was a nighttime landing, busy airspace, and as it was getting late, to keep an eye on each other. At time 37 minutes past 2 at the dead of night, they started their descent into San Francisco. They were following the arrival as instructed by the air traffic controller. Further, the ATC advised them to join the FMS bridge visual approach for runway 28 right after the last waypoint on the star. Meanwhile, other aircraft on the ground at San Francisco Airport were departing from runway 28 right and using Taxiway Charlie to reach the runway. Air traffic controller asked them to turn right to waypoint Dow and join the final approach to runway 28 right. At time 46 minutes past 2, air traffic controller cleared flight 759 for the FMS bridge visual approach for runway 28 right. By this time, the captain was awake since the last 19 hours and the first officer for last 12 hours, which is why I first talked about their schedule prior to this flight. The crew of this flight were fatigued for being awake for too long and flying at the time of circadian low. Air Canada's procedure for FMS bridge visual approach was to be at or before F101D at 1100 feet altitude and disengage the autopilot and continue the approach manually. Flight 759 was flown in open descent mode until waypoint F101D rather than managed mode, which could have reduced workload of the crew. Open descent mode is a selected vertical mode where the aircraft descends by pitching down to maintain the target airspeed, while managed mode refers to a flight mode where the aircraft follows the vertical, lateral, and speed profiles that have been programmed into the flight management computer. Flying in managed mode reduces crew workload, but as captain was flying in open descent mode, it added to the workload of the crew, especially the first officer, to cross-check aircraft altitude with respect to distance from the runway. The captain then disconnected the autopilot at 1300 feet altitude. The first officer switched off the flight directors and the captain turned the airplane right by 14 degrees to align with the runway 28 right. But little he did knew that he aligned the airplane not with the runway 28 right, but with the parallel taxiway Charlie. While the captain was aligning the aircraft with the runway, he mistook runway 28 right for runway 28 left and taxiway Charlie for runway 28 right. The first officer was focused inside the cockpit, performing routine tasks such as setting the missed approach altitude and heading. It took the first officer a bit longer to set the heading, as he needed to refer to the approach chart to confirm the correct missed approach heading. This slightly reduced the first officer's ability to monitor the approach by looking outside. The crew's failure to properly review the NOTAMs, combined with signs of fatigue and a more busy first officer, contributed to the error. The captain saw the lights, which he thought was of runway 28 right, but was confused and asked the first officer to check with air traffic controller that the runway is clear or not. As they were lined up with taxiway Charlie, there were 4 more airplanes waiting in line for takeoff at taxiway Charlie. At 55 minutes past 2, between 1100 and 600 feet, the first officer asked the air traffic controller,
And Tower, just want to confirm this Air Canada 759, we see some lights on the runway there, across the runway, can you confirm a clear to land?
The air traffic controller then visually scanned the runway and checked his radar display and said,
Air Canada 759, confirm clear to land runway 28 right, there is no one on 28 right, flight view.
At this moment, flight 759 was just 200 feet above ground and 2,300 feet from the seawall that protected the airfield from the San Francisco Bay. 1 second later, the captain from United Airlines Boeing 787, which was the first of the 4 airplanes lined up at taxiway Charlie, waiting for takeoff, saw the incoming Air Canada A320 and said,
Where's this guy going?
That exact moment, Air Canada Flight 759 was just 150 feet above ground and 500 feet from seawall and lined up, pointing towards taxiway Charlie. Seconds later, Air Canada Flight 759 horrifyingly flew over United Airlines Boeing 787 at 100 feet above the ground, to which the United Airlines captain said,
He's on the taxiway.
A Philippine Airlines Airbus A320 was behind United Airlines flight, waiting in line for takeoff. Watching Air Canada Flight 759 just flew over United Airlines airplane, the Philippines crew switched on the landing gear and nose gear lights to make the taxiway Charlie visible. Air Canada 759's captain at this moment felt that the things were not adding up and it did not look good. So finally he initiated a go-round, and the first officer at the exact same time also called for a go-round. They initiated the go-round at 89 feet with advancing the throttles forward and pitching the aircraft nose up. The engines spooled up, but they don't produce instant thrust. So the aircraft continued to descend due to inertia and reached a minimum altitude of 60 feet above the ground and over Philippine Airlines A340. Since there were 2 more airplanes behind Philippines A340, the Air Canada A320 first flew over another United Airlines Boeing 787 at 200 feet altitude and then flew over United Airlines Boeing 737 at 250 feet altitude. Air traffic controller advised Air Canada Flight 759 to go around and said,
Air Canada, go around.
In the go-around, Air Canada 759.
The go-around was flown perfectly. The crew then set up the approach again to runway 28 right. But this time, they did manually tune the ILS frequency and subsequently landed safely on runway 28 right. The minimum height difference between Air Canada Flight 759 and Philippine Airlines A340 was reported to be just 13.5 feet only. A split-second delay in the decision to go around, and the outcome could have been tragically different. In a post-incident interview, the crew of Delta Flight 521, a Boeing 737 that landed just 4 minutes before Air Canada Flight 759, stated that had they not been using LNAV, a lateral navigation system that guides aircraft towards the runway, it would have been very easy to mistake taxiway Charlie for runway 28 right. Expectation bias also played some role in this incident. Expectation bias is a type of cognitive bias where a person's preconceived expectations influence their perception, decisions, or interpretation of information, often without them realizing it. As in this case, the captain, when earlier flew to San Francisco, he never saw runway 28 left closed. Always he saw both runways 28 left and 28 right operational. This reinforced his expectation bias, leading him to believe that runway 28 right was actually 28 left and taxiway Charlie was runway 28 right. Fatigue was a contributing factor, as Canadian regulations do not allow for sufficient rest for reserve pilots. This can result in pilots operating in a fatigued state during the window of circadian low. Failure to tune ILS, which could have helped them to align with centerline of runway 28 right. Not reviewing no times. That's how small oversights in aviation can lead to major disasters. Aviation incident and accident investigations are not conducted to assign blame to pilots, but rather to learn from mistakes and continuously improve safety across the industry. In the darkness over San Francisco, Air Canada Flight 759 was just seconds away from disaster. 5 airplanes, 4 on the ground, 1 coming into land, on the wrong runway. A simple mistake, a moment of confusion, a runway that wasn't a runway at all, but a crowded taxiway filled with lights. And yet it didn't end in tragedy. Because someone saw it, someone spoke up, and the system, as fragile as it was, did just enough to stop the unthinkable. This wasn't just a close call, it was a warning, a chilling reminder that in aviation, there is no room for assumption, no room for complacency, no room for error. Flight 759 gave us a chance to change ourselves, to learn, to improve, to never forget how close we came.